A train carrying military equipment weighing over 2,000 tons is stuck. Everyone thinks they just need a bigger tractor. The old man asks for 5 antique machines, a steam tractor, a steam donkey, a steam roller, a cable winch, and a derrick crane. The engineers laugh. "Are you opening a museum?" they sneer. The old man simply looks at the mud and says, "No, I'm opening a path." The ground in Grey Rock Canyon does not just hold you, it consumes you. It is a treacherous mixture of silt and ancient volcanic ash that the locals call the Devil's Throat. When the Etherlink logistics train screeched to a halt, the sound echoed like a dying god for miles across the Oregon wilderness. 2,000 tons of cold steel, precision-engineered military hardware, and experimental turbines sat paralyzed. The tracks had vanished. The heavy sleepers were swallowed by the gray slurry. Marcus Sterling stood on the edge of the embankment. His Italian leather shoes were already ruined, coated in a thick, suffocating layer of silt. He did not care about the shoes. He was looking at his watch. Every 60 minutes that passed cost his company $500,000 in liquidated damages. Behind him, 3 massive modern recovery vehicles, monsters of hydraulic power with 2,000 horsepower each, were humming. Their steel cables were taut, vibrating with a high-pitched hum that signaled imminent failure. "Pull it!" Marcus screamed into his radio. The engines roared. Black smoke belched into the pristine Oregon sky. The cables groaned. But the train did not move. Instead, the rear of the leading recovery vehicle began to lift off the ground. The mud was acting like a giant suction cup. The more force they applied, the deeper the train sank. The laws of modern physics seemed to be working against them. The hydraulic fluid in one of the cranes reached its thermal limit and sprayed out in a hot, misty cloud. The machine died with a pathetic hiss. Marcus threw his radio into the dirt. He looked around at the circle of engineers, men with degrees from the finest schools, all staring at their tablets and calculating load distributions that meant nothing in the face of the Devil's Throat. That was when the old truck appeared. It was a rusted-out workhorse that looked like it belonged in a scrap heap. It rattled down the dirt track, trailing a plume of white dust. It stopped 50 yards away from the chaos. A man stepped out. Gideon Thorne was 70 years old. His skin was the color of seasoned leather, deeply etched with lines that told the story of 50 winters in the canyon. He didn't wear a hard hat. He wore a faded canvas jacket and a pair of boots that had seen more grease than polish. He didn't look at Marcus. He didn't look at the expensive cranes. He walked to the edge of the mud, knelt down, and dipped 2 fingers into the slurry. He rubbed the mud between his thumb and forefinger. He smelled it. Then he looked at the train. "You're fighting the earth," Gideon said. His voice was low, like stones grinding together at the bottom of a river. "The earth always wins when you move too fast." Marcus turned, his face flushed with rage. "Who the hell are you? This is a restricted zone. Get back in your wreck and get out of here." Gideon didn't flinch. He wiped his fingers on a rag. "I'm the man who owns the land 3 inches under that train, and I'm the only one who knows how to wake up the giants that can move it." Marcus laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "We have 6,000 combined horsepower on this line, old man. We have satellite-linked tension sensors. We have hydraulics that can lift a skyscraper. What do you have?" Gideon looked past the billionaire, toward the horizon where the sun was beginning to dip. "I have 5 machines, and I have the patience of the steam." The engineers chuckled. One of them, a young man with a pristine clipboard, stepped forward. "Sir, we've calculated the friction coefficient of this silt. It's impossible to create a stable anchor point. No tractor in the world has the traction." Gideon finally looked Marcus in the eye. His gaze was unsettlingly calm. It was the look of a man who had nothing to prove and everything to lose. "Your machines are loud, they are fast, but they are brittle. You want that train out before the midnight surge of the underground water table rises. When that hydrostatic pressure hits, the silt will liquefy completely, and it'll swallow that steel like a stone in a pond. Here is my price." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a piece of yellowed paper. It wasn't a formal contract. It was a hand-drawn map and a statement of terms. You return the water rights of Bitter Creek to the town. You sign over the deed to the old mill, and you pay me $100,000 for the recovery. Marcus looked at the paper, then at the sinking train. The front engine had already tilted 5 degrees to the left. If it tipped further, it would be a total loss, nearly $80 million of hardware gone. "You're insane," Marcus hissed. "You think I'm going to hand over corporate assets to a hermit because he has a few antique machines?" "Fine," Gideon said, turning back toward his truck. "In 3 hours, the silt will reach the axles. In 5, the vacuum will be so strong that even God won't be able to pull it out. Enjoy your scrap metal." Gideon reached the door of his truck. He didn't look back. He knew the psychology of a desperate man. He knew that pride is a luxury, but survival is a necessity. "Wait," Marcus shouted. The word tasted like ash in his mouth. "What machines? What could you possibly bring here that we don't already have?" Gideon stopped. He spoke over his shoulder, his voice carrying clearly through the cooling air. "I need a steam tractor, a steam donkey, a steam roller, a cable winch from the 1920s, and a derrick crane. The ones currently sitting in the shed at the Thorne estate." The engineers burst out laughing. "A museum? You're going to save an $80 million train with a museum exhibit?" Gideon climbed into his truck. "I'm not opening a museum. I'm opening a path. You have 10 minutes to sign that paper. After that, the price goes up." Before we continue this battle of iron and will, ask yourself, why are we so drawn to the story of the underdog? Perhaps it is because, in a world that feels increasingly out of our control, we want to believe that wisdom still carries more weight than wealth. We want to know that the things we've forgotten, the old ways, the steady hand, still have the power to save us. If you believe that experience is a treasure that never devalues, you've found a home here. Join our community by subscribing. It costs nothing, but it ensures that stories like Gideon's, stories of the silent heroes, are never buried by the noise of the modern world. Your support is the steam that keeps this channel moving. Marcus Sterling looked at the train. He looked at his watch. The silence of the canyon felt like a heavy weight. He grabbed a pen from his pocket. Marcus snatched the yellowed paper. His fingers trembled, not from cold, but from the searing heat of his own humiliation. He scrawled his signature. The ink bled into the fibers of the old parchment. Gideon watched him. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply took the paper, folded it twice, and tucked it into his breast pocket, right over his heart. "The machines will be here by dawn," Gideon said. "They better be," Marcus spat. "And they better work. If you waste one more second of my time, I'll have my legal team strip you of every acre you own. I'll turn this canyon into a gravel pit." Gideon didn't respond. He walked to his truck. The engine turned over with a rough, rhythmic cough. He drove away, leaving Marcus standing in the mud. The engineers gathered around their leader. They spoke in hushed tones about torque ratios and hydraulic PSI. They mocked the old man's list. A steam donkey, a machine from the era of logging camps and handsaws. It was a joke to them. To men who lived in the world of fiber optics and titanium, Gideon Thorne was a ghost from a past that was better left buried. But the night had other plans. At 2 a.m, the ground groaned. It was a sound like a wet cloth tearing. One of the massive modern cranes, a 500-ton behemoth, shifted. The ground beneath its stabilizing outriggers liquefied. The quick clay had reached its tipping point. With a sickening metallic snap, the primary hydraulic line of the crane burst. Red fluid sprayed across the white military crates. The crane tilted dangerously. The engineers scrambled, shouting, their expensive boots sinking to the calves. Marcus stood on the ridge, watching the chaos. He looked at the train. It was sinking faster now. The bottom of the main engine was shrouded in gray slime. The pride of Ether Link Logistics was being swallowed by a silent, patient enemy. Just as the sun began to bleed over the jagged edge of the canyon, a new sound arrived. It wasn't the high-pitched scream of a turbo diesel. It was a rhythmic, heavy thumping. Chuff, chuff, chuff. It was a heartbeat. A flatbed convoy arrived. But these weren't modern trucks. They were old, heavy-duty haulers, likely held together by sheer will and heavy grease. And on their backs sat the giants. The steam tractor came first. It was a Case 110, a mountain of black iron with wheels as tall as a man. Its brass fittings gleamed in the early light. Behind it came the steam donkey, a massive winch mounted on a sled of thick timber. Then, the steamroller, its heavy drum smelling of ancient tar. Finally, the derrick crane and the cable winch, looking like skeletons of a forgotten industrial age. Gideon stepped off the lead truck. He carried a tin pail of water and a bag of high-grade coal. He ignored the engineers who were now staring in stunned silence. He walked to the steam tractor and began to feed it. "Is this it?" Marcus walked down the slope. He looked at the rusted rivets and the exposed gears. "This is your salvation? I've seen better metal in a junkyard." Gideon opened the firebox. The orange glow reflected in his eyes. A junkyard is where things go when people forget how they work. These machines were built for a world that didn't have a backup plan. They were built to outlast the men who made them. He didn't explain his plan. He didn't show them a digital simulation. He began to work. He moved with a terrifying economy of motion. He shoveled coal. He oiled the grease cups. He checked the pressure gauges. The air began to fill with the scent of wood smoke and hot oil, a smell that had been absent from this canyon for nearly a century. The young engineer with the clipboard walked up to Gideon. "Look, Mr. Thorne, I've been running the numbers. Even if you get these things running, the combined pulling power is less than half of what we've already tried. You're going to snap those old cables." Gideon didn't stop his work. He looked at the young man. "You're calculating the pull. You should be calculating the grip." Gideon pointed to the steamroller. "That machine isn't for pulling, it's for speaking to the earth." The engineer frowned. "Speaking to it?" "The mud is hungry because it's full of water," Gideon said. "The roller doesn't just flatten. It vibrates at a frequency that breaks the vacuum seal between the mud and the steel. Right now, the earth is sucking on those wheels like a giant lung. We aren't going to pull against that vacuum. We're going to make the earth let go. Once the suction breaks, the steam will do the rest." Marcus stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "And how long does this conversation take, old man?" "As long as the steam demands," Gideon replied. He pulled a lever. A plume of white steam hissed from the tractor's chimney. The machine groaned, a deep guttural sound that vibrated in the chests of everyone standing there. "Now, get your men back. The giants are awake." The steamroller began its work first. It did not move toward the train. Instead, Gideon drove it in a slow, precise circle around the perimeter of the sinkhole. The heavy iron drum didn't just roll, it pulsated. Every time the piston fired, a shockwave traveled through the steel and into the saturated earth. The engineers watched, arms crossed. "He's just packing the surface," one muttered. "The mud is 30 feet deep. That's like putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound." Gideon ignored them. He was watching the ground 10 feet ahead of the roller. As the machine vibrated, a thin film of water began to bleed to the surface. The quick clay was being forced to give up its moisture. By vibrating the silt at a specific, low frequency, Gideon was breaking the surface tension that held the water in suspension. The mud began to settle, turning from a liquid soup into a dense, heavy paste. Next, he moved to the derrick crane. He didn't use it to lift. He used its massive boom to drive a series of thick, notched timber beams, deadman anchors, deep into the one stable ridge of solid granite at the canyon's edge. He didn't just drop them in. He wedged them at an angle that utilized the mountain's own weight against the pull of the train. Then came the steam donkey. This was the muscle. Gideon threaded a 2-inch thick braided steel cable through a complex web of multi-sheave pulley blocks anchored into the granite ridge. This was the ancient math of the block and tackle. By multiplying the steam donkey's raw torque through 5 stages of reduction, Gideon wasn't just pulling, he was exerting a force that could uproot a mountain. "The tension is too high," the lead engineer shouted, stepping forward with his tablet. "According to my sensors, that cable will snap at 90 tons of pressure. You need at least 400 to break the vacuum of that mud." Gideon didn't look up from the grease port he was filling. "Your sensors measure a static pull. Steam doesn't pull like a diesel engine. It breathes." He climbed onto the platform of the case steam tractor. He checked the boiler pressure, 300 pounds per square inch. The safety valve began to hiss, a high-pitched warning. Gideon reached for the throttle. His hand was steady. He didn't yank it. He moved it a fraction of an inch at a time. The symphony of steam began. The steam donkey groaned. The timber sled it was mounted on bit into the earth, anchoring itself against the granite ridge. The cable went taut. It didn't jerk. It stretched. It began to hum, a low, ominous note that vibrated in the teeth of everyone watching. "Now," Gideon whispered. He engaged the steam tractor. The massive rear wheels, over 7 feet tall, began to turn. They didn't spin. They bit into the compacted path created by the steamroller. The engine's exhaust barked, a rhythmic, deafening bang, bang, bang that echoed off the canyon walls like artillery fire. The train didn't move. Marcus Sterling stepped forward, a smirk returning to his face. "Nothing. You're just making noise, Thorne. All that smoke for nothing." Gideon didn't blink. He watched the water. Around the base of the train's wheels, the mud was beginning to crack. The vibration of the steamroller had weakened the vacuum. The steady, relentless torque of the steam donkey was holding the tension, and now the steam tractor was providing the surge. Gideon adjusted the cable winch. He was playing the tension like a master violinist. He would tighten, then hold, then tighten again. Suddenly, a sound like a gunshot rang out. The engineers flinched, but it wasn't a cable snapping. It was the sound of the air rushing back into the mud as the vacuum seal broke. "She's moving," someone gasped. The 2,000-ton train shifted, only an inch, but in the world of heavy recovery, an inch is everything. Gideon opened the firebox and threw in another shovel of coal. The heat turned his sweat into steam. The engine roared louder. The black iron of the tractor seemed to strain, its rivets groaning under the impossible load. But it didn't break. It couldn't break. It was a machine built for a time when things were over-engineered to survive the end of the world. Slowly, agonizingly, the train began to climb the ramp of compacted earth Gideon had prepared. It wasn't the brute force of 1,000 horses. It was the calculated, patient application of ancient laws. Marcus Sterling's smirk had vanished. He watched as his $80 million disaster was slowly reclaimed from the earth by 5 machines that should have been in a museum. He looked at Gideon Thorne, a man who looked as though he were merely out for a morning stroll. The train reached the edge of the steel rails, but it was balanced on a knife's edge. The heavy engine sat directly over the weakened crust of the subsidence zone. The groan of the mud faded, but the cable of the steam donkey remained taut, vibrating like a violin string. Gideon closed the throttle but kept his hand on the brake. "She's on the steel," Gideon said. But as Marcus stepped forward to reclaim his prize, Gideon didn't move. He stood between the billionaire and the controls, his hand white-knuckled on the release lever. "But she's not yours yet," Gideon added. "Right now, my winch is the only thing keeping those rails from buckling into the void." Marcus Sterling stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the train. He gestured to his security team. "All right, it's back on the rails. Clear the area. We'll take it from here. And Thorne? Don't bother waiting for the wire transfer. My legal team informed me that a contract signed under duress of a disaster isn't worth the paper it's printed on. You'll get a standard recovery fee in 90 days, maybe." The engineers chuckled, regaining their arrogance now that the danger had passed. Marcus turned his back on Gideon, already barking orders into his satellite phone to resume the transport. Gideon Thorne didn't shout. He didn't reach for a weapon. He simply walked back to the steam donkey. He placed his hand on the primary release lever, the one holding the 20-to-1 tension on the main chassis of the train. "Stop," Gideon said. It wasn't a shout. It was a command. Marcus turned around, a sneer on his lips. "What are you going to do, old man? Hold my train hostage? That's grand theft. I'll have you in a federal cell by midnight." Gideon pulled a second piece of paper from his pocket, a geological survey map dated 1912. He unfolded it slowly. "This canyon wasn't formed by a river, Mr. Sterling. It was formed by a collapse. Underneath those tracks, exactly where the engine is sitting right now, is a limestone cavern. It's been filled with silt for a century." He pointed to the ground. "Your heavy cranes didn't just sink because of the mud. They triggered a subsidence. Right now, the only thing keeping that 2,000-ton engine from breaking through the crust and dropping 60 feet into an underground lake is the tension on my steam donkey and the anchoring of my derrick crane." The lead engineer's face went pale. He snatched the map, his eyes darting between the old parchment and his tablet. He looked at the ground, then at the tension gauges. "He's right," the engineer whispered, his voice trembling. "The seismic sensors are picking up a hollow echo. If he releases that winch, the train drops, and it'll take the tracks and the bridge with it." Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. "You're bluffing." Gideon's hand tightened on the release lever. I've lived on this land for 70 years. I know every crack in the stone. You have 2 minutes to call your office and authorize the permanent transfer of the Bitter Creek water rights to the town trust. And I want the digital confirmation sent to the sheriff's office. That's millions of dollars in water rights, Marcus screamed. And that's an $80 million train, Gideon countered. Not to mention the environmental fine for dropping military hardware into an underground aquifer. Your choice, Marcus. Do you want to be a man of your word, or a man with a very deep hole in the ground? The silence in the canyon was absolute, broken only by the steady, rhythmic hiss of the steam tractor. Marcus looked at the lever. He looked at Gideon's eyes, eyes that had seen enough seasons to know that a man's soul is only as heavy as his promises. With a shaking hand, Marcus took his phone. He made the call. 10 minutes later, Gideon's old radio crackled. It was the town sheriff. Gideon, I don't know what you did, but the deed for the mill and the water rights just hit our system. We're official. Gideon nodded. He didn't let go of the lever. Now, get your men out of here. I'll pull the train the rest of the way to the granite shelf. Once it's on solid rock, I'm taking my machines and going home. Marcus Sterling didn't wait. He climbed into his black SUV and sped away, his tires kicking up the very dust he had failed to understand. He left behind his pride, his reputation, and a map he was too arrogant to read. Only after the confirmation arrived did Gideon engage the final pull. He moved the train another 50 yards past the hollow crust until the wheels sat on the ancient, unyielding solid bedrock. The danger was over. Gideon spent the next 4 hours carefully dismantling his rigging. He loaded the steam donkey, the roller, and the winch back onto the trucks. He drove the steam tractor himself, the massive wheels humming on the hard-packed road. He didn't go to the bank. He didn't buy a new truck. He went to the old mill at Bitter Creek. He sat on the porch as the water began to flow again, channeled back to the small farms and the thirsty cattle of the valley. The townspeople offered him a hero's welcome, but Gideon declined. He preferred the company of his machines. They didn't lie. They didn't cheat. They simply did the work they were built for. We live in a world that worships the new, the fast, and the flashy. We are told that the latest version is always the best. But stories like Gideon's remind us of a deeper truth. True power doesn't come from a battery or a microchip. It comes from the accumulated weight of experience, the patience to listen to the earth, and the integrity to stand your ground when the world tries to bury you. You are here because you value that weight. You are part of a rare group of people who still appreciate the sound of a steady engine and the value of a silent hero. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the strength in your own hands or the wisdom of those who came before you, then you belong with us. Hit the subscribe button to keep the fire in the boiler burning. Help us ensure that the legends of the silent giants are never forgotten. Gideon Thorne woke up the next morning at 5. He walked to his shed, picked up an oil can, and moved toward the steam tractor. There was a slight squeak in the main drive gear. He had work to do. The machines were quiet now, but they were ready. They were always ready.